Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps it is fitting that I am the next member to make an intervention after the close of the honourable member who led, who referred certainly to the spirit of the promise that I made to the people of St. Michael South Central and the slogan of care, commitment, and courage. So I take that as a cue that it is appropriate for me, sir, to make my intervention now. To you, sir, and through you, I of course wish all Barbadians and everyone a happy Day of Love. However you profess or express that, and of course we're not just talking about romantic love, but all love to all people and our fellow Barbadians. I dare say that it is not just in that spirit of care, commitment, and courage, but also in that spirit of love and responsibility, which go hand in hand, that this fiscal framework of the Government of Barbados is being discussed here today. And I want to take us right back to the beginning, to the origins of this document, to why it was required, to the framework in which it sits, the body of legislation and other operational activities of which it is a part. Because one may listen to the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central, who often comes to this honourable place to talk through you to the country about these issues, and think that he likes to come in here and lay documents, or that the Government of Barbados likes to come in here and lay documents because that is what we enjoy doing. But sir, this is about a process of accountability. And when we come to this honourable place to talk about the record of this government, to compare it to previous records, to compare it to what we might do in the future, it is not to boast, it is not to gloat. Certainly in my case, it is not to find fault unduly. It is for the purpose of accountability. And so the fiscal framework that is being discussed here today is a part of a system of transparency, accountability, and integrity of government. And we will, sir, have occasion to talk about this some more in the future when we discuss the integrity legislation. But I want to emphasize that it is not just a piece of integrity legislation or an integrity bill that causes government to do the right thing in the right way. And I take us back to the period before 2018, when there was much, I dare say, that was left to chance. There was a lot that we did not know about the government's operations, about the government's fiscal operations, because we were not told. There was a lot that we did not know because the then government did not think it appropriate to come back to the people and to report adequately on what was being done in their name. At that time, there was a lot of guesswork. We saw a certain level of printing of money at the level of the central bank and of the national insurance, and we could only respond after the fact because we were not sure what was the framework, what were the rules, were they being contravened or not. Government was not coming back to say, well, we had to do this notwithstanding this rule because we found ourselves in this position. And so the fiscal framework stands in the context of the Public Financial Management Act of 2019, which this government brought at that time to be able to say to the people of Barbados, you will always know what we do in your name. We are accountable to you. And I want us as Barbadians to understand what is contained in that Public Financial Management Act, because it is not just a declaration of assets of MPs and board chairmen and deputy chairs that keeps us honest. It is not just an integrity bill or integrity legislation that keeps us honest. The Public Financial Management Act 2019 tells us how every organ of the government, how every officer of the government is meant to operate, is meant to perform, is meant to behave relative to other departments of government, relative to the Ministry of Finance, and relative to the people of Barbados in whose name we operate and whom we serve. Similarly, the Central Bank Act, which, again, legislation is alive and from time to time needs to be amended. I suspect there will need to be further amendments. But we did bring amendments at that time to be able to say, listen, there has to be a ceiling, there has to be a limit on the amount of printing that can be done by the central bank. And so this fiscal framework is a part of the system of accountability. It is not just a document that we like to put on a shelf because we like to write things, even though it is, I dare say, well written and easy to understand. And I start at the beginning in the document, which features a statement of responsibility, referring to the Public Financial Management Act, the third schedule, and declaring that the information contained in the fiscal framework is reliable and meets the information requirements of the Act. And it names some exceptions, because these are the kinds of data sets, expenditure data in administrative and functional classification and so on. These are some of the things that vary, that change, that based on when estimates are approved, some of this data will change, and these are some of the data sets that we expect are not set in stone in documents such as this. But the things that I am pointing out to you, I do so, sir, not as an administrative exercise, but to say that government has a responsibility to report duly and truly to the people it serves. And this statement of responsibility features the signature of the minister responsible for finance and the signature of the director of finance. And I say these things because I want us to understand that this government takes seriously and must continue to take seriously its duty to report and to be accountable. And I go further because, sir, some of the feedback that I will share here, some of it has already been shared with my good friend, the honourable member who led, but it is my duty to speak it into the record here so that it stands as a recommendation of this Parliament. Because similarly, the recommendations of Parliament and government's response to those recommendations are also to be made a public record and to be made available on an official website of government. And as a part of this fiscal framework, Cabinet has a responsibility to consider the recommendations made by Parliament in respect of this document. They're not required to make changes based on those recommendations. One can only recommend. But I go through these things because I want to demonstrate that this is not an academic exercise. The things that I stand here and say today, sir, must in some ways be considered, and any comment of any member standing as a record of Parliament has to in some ways be considered as the proceeds of this debate, with a view to taking them forward as recommendations to the Cabinet. And so, in that regard, I want to make some observations on the document that is before us. I should say, however, that as a part of that system of transparency, the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs also has a duty to bring to this honourable place the Barbados Economic and Social Report, which is meant to give us a bit more flesh on the performance of its programs. And I want to encourage that ministry to make sure that that report forms a part of the reporting of this government to the country. I think that perhaps it must come for a few years now. Perhaps some kind of omnibus report to be able to cover those years, but it does have to come and to be laid and considered by this honorable place, because it is a part of the system of accountability to the people. And so I say all these things because, often I think there's the notion that we are just talking about things that we've done because we want to look like we're earning our pay, or we're earning our place. But really, the duty of a government is to be accountable. And so when one hears us, when the people of Barbados hear us giving these reports, it is because we were sworn so to do, but also because, and I can only speak for myself, I would never want to be associated with the practices or absence thereof, the lack of fiscal rectitude and fiscal discipline and accountability of the administration that preceded us. The reason that we brought the PFM Act was so we could never return to that place under this government or under any other to come. And so I want us to understand that this is about accountability. It's not just about coming here and reciting numbers to the people. But even as we share those numbers, even as we share the outlook, even as we talk about what has happened in the previous year and what we expect to happen with respect to debt and the primary balance and all these things, I also want us to understand that these macro issues are not similarly academic. The reason that we have to be fiscally responsible is the same reason that you have to do that in your household, sir. The reason that we have to know how much we have to spend, how much debt we have, is so that when we go to the supermarket, we know whether we can get the big cabbage or the small cabbage. We know what is our elbow room, what is our wiggle room to make expenditures on behalf of the people of this country. So I say that because I want us to understand that projecting expenditure, knowing how much we take in revenue, knowing how much we borrowed, all of that tells us what we can spend on in education, in healthcare, in road infrastructure, and so on, in the name of the people in Barbados. It is not an academic exercise. It tells us what we have, what we can spend, and how we must prioritize given that we don't have all to spend that we might want to spend. And so in that regard, I want to focus on perhaps three things in this fiscal framework. The first of those has to do with something that the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central took some time to review, and that has to do with the COVID expenditures. Now, there has been a lot of discussion on the fact that we borrowed and how much we borrowed and when and so on. And I am almost loath to repeat the rationale for borrowing, to say that if you are building a house, you do not go and take up every cent that you may have and start to build the house. Because if something happens to you tomorrow, you don't have that liquidity to be able to buy anything that you need. What you would more likely do, although some of us choose not to go that way, and some of us will start taking up every cent we have and start to build the house, and whatever comes, comes. But what you're more likely to do is to borrow to build a house. And why? Because you will continue to get value from that asset as you pay towards it. As you repay the loan that you took to build the house, you continue to get value and to build value in that asset. And that is why you borrow, not for day-to-day expenditures, you borrow for long-term infrastructure that will continue to serve the population today and future generations. And so when people say, are my children going to be expected to repay this debt? Yes. And why? Because your children will continue to get the value from this asset that is being created. It is just like we, in some ways, are repaying debt for assets that were built, that were constructed, that were established 20 or so years ago, because we continue to get devalued. Now, the responsibility of government is to make sure that it makes the right decisions about what that debt should go to pay for. It must be something that gives us value. But the notion that a country is not to borrow when every country in the world borrows, I again want to put that to bed. The question of the level of debt is important. We have to make sure we can service it. We have to make sure that servicing the debt doesn't stop us from putting money into school meals so that our children can eat. I am convinced as of today that we are at a sustainable place when it comes to debt. Because in 2017, coming into May 2018, we were paying 68 cents out of every dollar earned by the government of Barbados towards debt service. The more recent number that I have, and the member for Christchurch East Central, once he wraps up, may have a more recent one, but to my last knowledge, it was about 32 cents on the dollar that we were paying towards debt service, which means we have 68 cents to spend, to invest in the young people of Barbados, to spend on cybersecurity, to spend on education, to spend on a new facility for the Youth Advanced Corps. That is the difference, and that is why these questions matter. But I also want, and perhaps my first recommendation would be, that the fiscal framework lay out a schedule of expenditure that is, one, related to COVID and any other similar eventualities that have a fiscal impact, so that we see in one of the schedules and one of the appendices to the framework exactly what was the spending on these kinds of activities. Because it is right here on page 10 of the framework. 10 million to the Welfare Department to meet the additional cost of grants, 10 million to the Household Survival Program, 10 million to the Adopt a Family Program, 3.5 million to the National Assistance Board to establish a community elder care program. Sir, there is perhaps no other country in the world that in the midst of COVID invested in the household economy. Had people going into households to provide care. People don't realize that care is an economic good, you know. Care is something that reproduces your economy, because none of us would be in here dressed and cared for and presentable this morning unless we had care at some point along the way. I'm not going to get into conjecture about who ironed their own clothes or who made their own breakfast. But care is what causes us to be here to produce in this capitalist system that we regrettably must be a part of. And so this is a government that invested in care, community elder care program, going into households and providing care in the midst of COVID, when people were less able to do so. 48.8 million for the management of the COVID-19 program by the QEH. 10.7 million to the QEH to assist with current operations. 23.8 million to the Transport Board to offset the fact that there was an absence of movement. 3.5 million to provide financial relief to vendors, 10 million to the Ministry of Education in the context of COVID. And I say to the member for Christchurch East Central, because I gather that this is a snapshot, that we should see all the expenditures in this fiscal framework. We as the people of Barbados must be able to understand exactly what it means to be able to mobilize emergency resources and then spend it for the purpose for which it is intended. And to be able to satisfy ourselves that that is in fact what has happened. But the fiscal framework goes further in explaining any deviations in revenue outturn. Imagine that, and a member who led will recall that in 2016, 2017, when we sat as part of an opposition economic team at the time, trying to understand what was happening with the economy, there was no such data that could be available to us. To be able to say, look, we thought we were going to take in this amount in revenue, and we did not. And you know why we did not? Here is why. Deviations in expenditure outturn. We were supposed to spend X and Y, but then COVID happened and we had to redirect some of these resources to health and to education and to the Ministry of People Empowerment. This is an explanation of what are the reasons that instead of going through Grosvenor Road, we had to stop short and come through Baycroft Road and come round. Because we have to explain why we took the decisions that we took. This is an exercise in accountability, and I don't want us to take it for granted. But further, and I made that recommendation on the record, so perhaps for the minister to consider. But I also want us to understand, and I should say to absorb, the priorities that the honourable member who laid out that appear on page 6 of this framework. Because again, this is not just about talking about GDP and debt to GDP and primary balance because we have those numbers and we can say them. These numbers mean something. These numbers and the programs behind them mean something to the people of Barbados. But I want us to be able to get behind the narrative and to get behind the words. There are several priorities outlined here, and a couple in particular draw my attention. One has to do with the target for a comprehensive procurement framework. And in some other place, I believe the Minister in Finance, the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central, mentioned the plans to establish an e-procurement system and so on. I want to remind us that putting something online does not make it efficient. And that we have some other issues to address with respect to procurement. We are aware of the value of government procurement when it comes to providing economic activity and providing opportunities for Barbadians. We said, prior to 2018, that we would use the government procurement system and the practice to be able to make opportunities available to all Barbadians. Now, we had, during COVID, to make some emergency decisions, and we said to the people of Barbados that we would publish information on any contract that we had to quickly put in place because of the emergency nature. Any contract over $1 million, we would publish that. Every time I get to my feet, sir, and this point is relevant, I will make it, that the publication of that information, whether in COVID or not, is critical to the trust and accountability of this government. Beyond that, the information on contract awards overall should further be made available. But in addition, I think that we also need to be very clear on the procurement methodologies that obtain when it comes to major capital works. Because the sheer volume of government goods and service and the sheer value, the amount of millions for which is responsible, means that we have to use it as an opportunity for people in this country and their small businesses to earn and to be part of the growth and to contribute. And I see no reason why we should not publish contracts over $1 million, as we said we would, whether in an emergency situation or not, why we should not publish contract awards of a certain size. But further, we need to also make clear the methodology by which consultants and businesses have been selected for major projects and major works in this country. And I say that because I have talked about the PFM Act, I have talked about the Central Bank Act, I've talked about the Declaration of Assets, I've talked about the pending economic and social reports that are to come to this place. And the way that we manage procurement must be a part of that. And again, one does not point out these things because one suspects that anything is amiss. Certainly one does not. But the only way that we will show that we will prove that we will give companies the assurance that when you bid on a project, it is considered in good faith. You know the selection method that we are using. You know the procurement method that we are using. You understand why you may not have gotten the contract. Making all of that transparent is also part of this exercise in accountability. And I do, that we have to maintain the confidence of those that we are contracting in this economy, few as they are, to be able to come in good faith to our procurement exercises and to feel that they have a shot. And I am cautioning that we have to make that very, very transparent, because to do otherwise is to risk the onward and the ongoing development of the country. Because if I come to an exercise and I feel that I am not being considered duly and fairly within whatever framework you've laid out, I'm not going to come tomorrow. I'm not going to come next week. And so as part of this, I think that we need to, beyond the e-procurement, how are we allowing all actors to access, to have an opportunity to bid for government contracts and services? But also, what in particular are we doing to help support the small business sector? I've seen in many cases where small providers frankly don't have the wherewithal to be able to be considered for projects. And while government has to satisfy itself that these actors can perform, we also have to expand the mandate of economic enfranchisement into something that is material. We have to be able to say at the end of this year or at the end of the framework period for this document, previously there were 10 small contractors. Now there are 20, now there are 30, now there are 40. We also need to report on that. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't hold them accountable similarly. That if individuals are not responsibly carrying out the activities under their contract, that we should not say to them, well, I'm sorry, we can't give you any more houses to build, or we can't give you any more schools to repair. But let's make sure that, we talk in economics about market failures all the time. That's why government is here. Because if we left it up to the market, all of the people who are already in a position to make bids and who have all the capital to satisfy the requirements will continue to get the contracts. The market failure there is that the smaller companies are less able to do so. And the role of government then is to come in and find ways to maintain its own integrity and its own transformational agenda and to execute, but also to make sure that those others can be a part of this inclusive growth that the member has been talking about. The third issue, and final, for me in my short intervention, sir, has to do with the issue of investment. And the list of priorities on pages 6 and 7 include two things that I wanted to mention. One is upkeep and renewal of the capital stock, an expansion of the infrastructure necessary for investment, as well as creating a balance sheet of underutilized assets as part of a Barbados legacy fund. Now, the reason I twin those things is that I think that the register of assets should be the government's register of assets, underutilized or not. It is when we have that register that we know what's underutilized. But we need to know and see, what does the government own? Is it being used properly today? Can it be better used? And that will also help inform the issue of the upkeep and renewal of the capital stock. Because we have assets that if we don't start the work of maintaining them, that they will be less usable or perhaps not usable at all in the future. So I believe that a register of assets as a matter of public record also has to be established so that we understand how government can make use of what it has to the value of the people of Barbados. And similarly, we also have to find a way to be able to convert those. When we first came to service, we used to talk about 9 billion in savings. Now we're above 14 billion, I believe, in savings, domestic savings here in this country. Now, while that is a good indicator to the extent that it means that you can only save if you're earning something, it means that there's increased economic activity and people are able to save. It also means that there are these pent-up savings in the economy. People are keeping money in one place, whereas we want this money to go to other places. We want to see investments in things that can be productive for people. The member talked about boss bonds. There are other kinds of enterprises, and I'll give an example. I know someone who makes candles and sells, and these are exceptional products. I'm not much of a candle person myself, but it is a product that is doing well. All of us in here can name small companies that will not on their own go public and become publicly traded, but that we have to find a way to be able to, or provide a platform for people to say, you know what, I'm going to bet on this young woman who's making these candles. I'm going to bet on this young woman who's making these swimsuits. I am going to support real organic growth in the small business sector through my own savings and my own effort. What is the vehicle that allows me to do that? And so, yes, it may be good for the Ministry of Finance to say, well, we have savings and we believe this is good because it means that people are earning and so on. The pent-up savings mean that there are economic enterprises that are potentially going without investment, when they could be growing, when they could be employing more people, and so on. We talk about the need for inclusive growth, inclusive job-led growth, and that is important. The way that that happens, though, is one that I think that we have to make an intervention in, to make sure that we create the platforms where people can bet on each other, where we can bet on each other. Where we have the protection of some kind of mechanism so that it's not just us taking up, not just the member for Christchurch West taking up $100,000 and saying, man, take that and do what you gotta do, because then his investment will not be protected. But how do we create a platform where we have a protected mechanism where we can invest in fellow Barbadians? I know that there's some of us who, if we have $5, we want to bet $1 on a friend, on a colleague. And I think it is time for us to make these things happen. So, sir, I will not delay this place too much more, except to reiterate that I want us to appreciate how far we have come. And a gentleman said to me in the supermarket this weekend. I told him that I enjoy some of his social media posts because he's a hilarious guy that most of us know about, but I will not call his name. I told him that I enjoy his social media posts, but I can never respond because I can't enter the fray on such matters. And he said to me, "Man, you are a Barbadian first. You should be able to respond." And perhaps that is true. I am a Barbadian first. And because I am a Barbadian first is the reason I can take a step back and appreciate where we have come in the process of accountability. I feel sometimes we forget. There was a moment where if I had to do any research, if somebody in another country asked me a question, I could not tell you what was happening with the finances in this country in 2016, 2017. I did not know. I could not find it anywhere. Central banks stopped publishing data. We have now come to a place where we have ministries and departments reporting, I believe it is still by the 5th day of the following month, where we have systems for making sure that what we say we will do is what we are doing. And as this framework points out, if we haven't been able to do it, if we have a deviation, that we come back to people and we tell the people of Barbados why. I talk all the time about a culture of evidence. I want to see us in this country embrace a culture of evidence. Why? Because if we know and trust and believe that this framework that is signed by the Minister in Finance or the Minister of Finance and the Director of Finance is before us, then we can say, well, I know this was done because it is here. And if it is here and it wasn't done, then there are also avenues to address that under the strongest force of the law. But I want us to understand that we are now in a place with a government that takes accountability seriously. We had not had that for some time. And so I support wholeheartedly the exercise and the continuing work. I encourage us to expand and to embrace the procurement side of that by making all of that information similarly transparent, not just the awards, but also the process. When I submit a bid, are you just taking that because you want to compare it with others' best 2 or best 3 to be able to say, well, I have a record? Are you taking my bid in good faith? Are you considering it? Or are you just putting it in a drawer? I want to know the methodology, and I want to know who wins the award. Now, obviously, in Barbados, we have to be careful.
Your member has 2 more minutes.
Oh, dear. I'm wrapping up. Sir, I had come to expect so much latitude from you that this is a bit of a jolt to my system. But
when I call time, I let the referee. When I call time, it is time.
I trust and believe you, sir. But do we have the faith that when we enter an exercise, that is what will actually happen? And while we have to make allowances for the fact that we live in a very small place, and so we have to be careful, to be practical, we have to be careful that we are not making victims of people who are only trying to play their trade. But I do think that we have to extend this fiscal rectitude and this transparency and the work that the government has done to that area of procurement. We need to be able to move the needle on investment, and I trust and I encourage the people of Barbados to continue to trust that this is a government that is on that path, continues to be on that path, to establishing real transparency, accountability, and integrity in this country. I'm obliged to you, sir.